Greensboro, North Carolina, 1952. A dirt road, summer heat so thick you can feel it pressing down. Two boys, maybe 12 years old, running through a field of tobacco plants taller than their heads. One of them is Frank Lucas. The other is a boy named Calvin Reed. They run the same roads, fish the same creek, sleep under the same Carolina sky. They share the specific intimacy of boys who grow up in the same place at the same time, a closeness that isn't chosen so much as absorbed, built into the body the way the smell of the earth gets built in, permanent and deep. 22 years later, Calvin Reed is in a federal holding room in Newark, New Jersey. He has been there for 72 hours. Across the table from him, a DEA agent named Howard Brennan has been asking the same questions in different configurations for 3 days straight. The questions always come back to the same point, the same name, the same request. Tell us about Frank Lucas. Tell us about the operation. Tell us what you know, and you walk out of here. Don't tell us, and you do 10 years minimum, probably 15. Calvin Reed is 42 years old. He has a wife in Newark, 3 children, a daughter in her first year of high school who wants to be a nurse, a son who plays football well enough that a college has expressed interest. He has not said a single word in 72 hours. Not one word. On the morning of the 4th day, the door to the holding room opens. Agent Brennan looks up, expecting his supervisor, expecting a lawyer, expecting anyone except the man who walks through the door. Frank Lucas sits down across from Calvin Reed. He looks at his oldest friend for a long moment. Then he says something that nobody in the room, not Brennan, not the other agents listening through the wall, not Calvin Reed himself, expected. He doesn't say, "Stay strong." He doesn't say, "Don't tell them anything." He doesn't say, "I'll take care of your family." He says, "Calvin, tell them what they need to know." The room goes very still. Calvin Reed looks at Frank Lucas, looks at the man he has known since they were 12 years old running through tobacco fields, the man who brought him to New York, gave him a role, trusted him with pieces of the operation that nobody else touched. The man whose word, for 20 years, was the organizing principle of Calvin Reed's professional life. Tell them. Calvin Reed starts talking, and what he says, what he gives the DEA over the next 6 hours, is both everything and less than they hoped. Because Calvin Reed knew his piece. He knew it completely, in perfect detail. But Frank Lucas had built the operation the way he built everything, in compartments. Calvin knew what Calvin needed to know. No more. What the DEA gets from Calvin Reed is a piece of the picture. A significant piece. A piece that advances the case materially. What they get from Frank Lucas's decision to walk into that room and tell his oldest friend to talk, that is something else entirely. That is the moment when Frank Lucas decides that loyalty has limits, and that the limits are not where anyone expected them to be. To understand Calvin Reed, you need to understand what the country boys were before they were in operation. They were home. Frank Lucas had left Greensboro, North Carolina in his early teens. He had come north with nothing, no money, no connections, no plan except the general, powerful intention to survive and then to do more than survive. He had found Harlem. He had found Bumpy Johnson. He had found the world that would eventually make him. But he had never stopped being from Greensboro. This is a thing that people who grow up in particular places understand, and people who don't sometimes fail to grasp. Where you come from is not just geography. It is a set of relationships, a set of shared experiences, a set of people who knew you before you were anything, who remember you as a child running through tobacco fields, who are connected to you by the specific bond of having inhabited the same small world at the same time. Frank Lucas maintained those connections across 2 decades of building his empire. He went back to North Carolina. He kept in contact with the people he had grown up with. He was, to the men and women of his home community, a success story, a man who had made it in New York, who sent money home, who appeared occasionally like a figure from a larger world, generous and well-dressed and evidently doing well. When he began recruiting for what would become the Country Boys operation, he was not creating something artificial. He was formalizing something that already existed, a network of relationships, rooted in shared origin, that had been maintained through years of separation. The men he recruited, Calvin Reed, James Green, Thomas Tuck, half a dozen others whose names appear in the DEA files and then disappear into the ordinary obscurity of lives lived after crisis. These were not strangers vetted for criminal reliability. They were men Frank Lucas had known since childhood, men whose families he knew, whose histories he knew, whose characters he understood, not from criminal assessment, but from the longer, deeper knowledge of shared origin. This was the genius of the Country Boys model, and it was also its fundamental humanity. Frank Lucas was not simply being strategically clever when he recruited from home. He was doing what humans do, building his most important structure from the people he trusted most. And the people he trusted most were the people he had known longest. Calvin Reed had been one of Frank Lucas's closest friends since they were 12 years old. When Frank came to Greensboro in 1968 and sat down with Calvin Reed and explained what he was building and what he needed and what Calvin's role would be, Calvin had listened, had asked questions, practical questions, the questions of a man assessing a proposition rather than being swept up in it, had taken 3 days to decide. And then had said yes, not because the money was irresistible, though the money was significant, not because Frank Lucas was his oldest friend, though he was, but because Calvin Reed, at 40 years old, working a factory job in Greensboro that paid enough to live on and not enough to do anything else, had looked at his options and decided that Frank Lucas's proposition was the best one available to him. This is the decision that is hardest to romanticize and easiest to understand. Calvin Reed was not seduced. He was not coerced. He was a grown man who assessed his circumstances and made a choice. He moved to Newark. He took the role Frank had described. He ran his piece of the distribution network with the same quiet competence that characterized everything Frank Lucas valued in his people. He sent money back to his family in Greensboro. He enrolled his children in better schools than they would have attended if he had stayed. He built a life in Newark that was more comfortable and more prosperous than anything he had had before. For 6 years this worked. The DEA spent years trying to understand why the Country Boys were so difficult to crack. The conventional criminal organization has conventional vulnerabilities. People recruited from the existing criminal infrastructure come with existing law enforcement relationships, prior arrests, known associates, handlers who have been cultivated over years. They come with habits and social patterns that surveillance can map. They come with the specific fragility of people who are accustomed to the criminal world's particular calculus of loyalty and betrayal. The Country Boys had none of these vulnerabilities. They had no criminal records, most of them, no prior relationships with law enforcement, no existing informant handlers, no documented associations with known criminal figures. They moved to northern cities, Newark, Baltimore, Philadelphia, as people who appeared to be exactly what they were on their surfaces, working men from the South, looking for better opportunities, living quietly, not drawing attention. They were, in the language of counterintelligence, clean. And they were clean not because Frank Lucas had found some special category of person who was immune to law enforcement attention. They were clean because they came from a world that law enforcement had not been watching. The DEA's intelligence networks were built around the existing criminal infrastructure. They had files on Harlem's operators, on the Italian mob's distribution networks, on the known figures in the northeastern drug trade. They had nothing on men from Greensboro, North Carolina, who had never been arrested, who had no known associations, who simply appeared one day in Newark and started living ordinary lives. But the operational security of the Country Boys was not primarily structural. It was cultural. The men Frank Lucas recruited were not loyal because the organizational architecture required their loyalty. They were loyal because of who they were loyal to. Frank Lucas, the man from home. The man they had known since childhood. The man whose mother they had met, whose people they knew, who was embedded in the same web of community relationships that defined their own identities. Betraying Frank Lucas was not simply a strategic calculation about personal risk and benefit. It was something that reached deeper, into identity, into community, into the specific obligations that people feel toward those who are genuinely their own. This is the thing that the DEA's psychological assessments of the Country Boys consistently underestimated. They were looking for the leverage points that work against conventional criminal associates: money, fear, family pressure, the promise of reduced sentences. These leverage points work because conventional criminal associates' loyalty is fundamentally instrumental. They are loyal because loyalty serves their interests. and they will betray when betrayal serves their interests better. The country boy's loyalty was not primarily instrumental. It was relational. It was the loyalty of people who genuinely did not want to hurt someone they genuinely cared about. This is not impossible to break. No loyalty is impossible to break, given sufficient pressure and sufficient time. But it is much harder to break, and it breaks differently. It breaks not when the calculation tips, when the benefit of betrayal exceeds the cost, but when something more fundamental gives way. When the person holding the loyalty decides, at some level they cannot always articulate, that the relationship that sustained the loyalty is no longer what they believed it to be. For 6 years, the country boy's loyalty held, because for 6 years, Frank Lucas was what they believed him to be. By 1974, the DEA's investigation of Frank Lucas had produced a substantial operational picture. Roberts and his team understood the distribution architecture well enough to identify the country boys as the human infrastructure of the operation. They had begun, systematically, to identify and approach individual country boys as potential informants. The approach was methodical. Identify a country boy. Build a case that justified arrest. Make the arrest. Present the offer. Cooperate and receive consideration, or face the full weight of the charges. Most of these approaches failed. The men arrested, quietly, without fanfare, in ways that were designed not to tip off the larger network, sat in holding rooms and said nothing. Some asked for lawyers immediately. Some simply waited. None of them, in the initial wave of approaches, provided the DEA with what it needed. Howard Brennan had been assigned to Calvin Reed specifically because Brennan's supervisors believed Reed was the most vulnerable target in the Country Boys network. Not because he was the weakest, by all assessments. Calvin Reed was one of the most capable and most trusted members of the operation, but because the intelligence suggested that Reed had family pressures that might make him susceptible to the standard offer. The daughter who wanted to be a nurse. The son with the football scholarship possibility. A wife who, by all accounts, did not fully understand the nature of her husband's business. A family that was genuinely, in the specific way that matters, innocent. Brennan was good at his job. He had broken difficult subjects before. He understood that the way to reach a man who won't respond to direct pressure is to find what he cares about that is not himself, and then to make the threat to that thing specific, credible, and unavoidable. He laid out the case against Calvin Reed in precise detail. He explained the charges. He explained the sentencing guidelines. He explained, with the specific clarity that prosecutors use when they want a subject to understand that this is not negotiable, what 10 years in federal prison meant for a man with 3 children, a wife and a daughter who wanted to be a nurse. He offered the alternative: cooperation, reduced charges, the possibility of a sentence that was months rather than years. Calvin Reed said nothing. For 72 hours, Calvin Reed said nothing. Brennan had broken subjects in 48 hours. He had never encountered 72 hours of complete silence from a non-lawyer subject. By the end of the 3rd day, he was beginning to revise his assessment of Calvin Reed's vulnerability. And then Frank Lucas walked through the door. Frank Lucas's decision to walk into that federal holding room and tell Calvin Reed to cooperate is the most debated moment in the Frank Lucas story that nobody outside the DEA's case files knows about. Why did he do it? The operational explanation is the most obvious. Frank Lucas knew, by 1974, that the walls were closing. He was aware that the DEA was systematically working through the Country Boys network. He understood that the compartmentalization he had built into the operation would limit what any single country boy could provide, but he also understood that accumulated pieces add up. Every country boy who cooperated gave the DEA another piece. Enough pieces and the picture becomes complete. If Calvin Reed was going to talk eventually, and Frank Lucas, reading the situation with the same cold precision he applied to everything, may have concluded that eventually was inevitable, then it was better for Frank Lucas to control the terms of that cooperation. To walk in, to tell Calvin to talk, to frame what Calvin said within limits that Frank Lucas defined. This is a possible reading. It is not an impossible one. But it misses something. Frank Lucas walked into that room and sat across from his oldest friend. A man he had known for 30 years. A man whose children he knew by name. A man who had sat in silence for 72 hours rather than say a word that might hurt Frank Lucas. And Frank Lucas told him to talk. Not because it was operationally optimal, because it was the only decent thing left to do. Calvin Reed had held his silence for 3 days out of loyalty, out of the specific, deep loyalty of a man protecting someone he genuinely loved. And Frank Lucas, sitting across that table, understood something that his operational calculus could not fully account for. Calvin Reed's loyalty had cost Calvin Reed 3 days of his life, 10 years of potential freedom, and the specific terror of a man watching everything he had built for his family begin to collapse. The loyalty was real. The cost of the loyalty was real. And Frank Lucas, whatever else he was not a man who could sit across from the person paying that cost and say, "Keep paying it." He said, "Tell them what they need to know." It was, in its way, the most human thing Frank Lucas ever did. And it was also, characteristically, calibrated. Calvin Reed knew his compartment. He knew it completely, in perfect detail, and the DEA would get every piece of that compartment when Calvin talked. But he did not know the next compartment, or the one after that. The compartmentalization that Frank Lucas had built into the operation from the beginning meant that Calvin Reed's cooperation, however complete within its limits, could not collapse the whole structure. Frank Lucas told Calvin to talk. Calvin talked. The DEA got what Calvin could give them. And Frank Lucas walked out of the federal building having done the one thing his oldest friend needed and the one thing his operational interests could absorb. Both things were true. They were the same decision. Here is what the DEA files record about Calvin Reed after his cooperation. He received a reduced sentence. The charges were consolidated, the sentencing guidelines applied favorably, and Calvin Reed served 18 months in a federal facility in Pennsylvania. He was released in 1976. His daughter graduated from nursing school in 1979. His son did not receive the football scholarship. The arrest and the disruption to the family had consequences that a scholarship committee was not willing to overlook. He works, as of the last available record, in logistics in Newark. Calvin Reed's wife stayed. This is not a given. The wives of men who go to federal prison on drug trafficking charges do not always stay. She stayed. By accounts of people who know them, they have been married for 47 years. Calvin Reed has not spoken publicly about Frank Lucas. He has not given interviews. He has not participated in the mythology making that has turned Frank Lucas into a cultural icon. He is, in this sense, exactly what he was when he arrived in Newark in 1968, a private man, living a life that doesn't make history books. The DEA files contain a notation from Agent Brennan, written after Calvin Reed's cooperation. Subject provided complete and accurate information about his operational role. Information consistent with other intelligence. Demeanor throughout cooperation. Calm. No apparent resentment toward principal target. When asked about Frank Lucas, subject stated, "He told me to talk. I talked. That's the end of it." That's the end of it. 4 words that contain everything about Calvin Reed's relationship to what happened. The specific economy of a man who has processed something difficult and declined to make more of it than it is. He was told to talk. He talked. That's the end of it. Frank Lucas and Calvin Reed did not, in the public record, have a documented relationship after 1974. Whether they spoke, whether the friendship that began on a dirt road in Greensboro survived what happened in a federal holding room in Newark, this is not recorded anywhere. What is recorded is this. When Calvin Reed needed Frank Lucas to release him from an impossible obligation, Frank Lucas walked through a door that most men in his position would not have opened. He could have left Calvin in that room. Could have let the loyalty hold until it broke on its own, under the weight of the charges, the family pressure, the accumulated cost of silence. The break, when it came, would have been worse. More damaging. More complete. He chose not to. He walked in and said, "Tell them." This is the moment that the mythology of Frank Lucas can't quite accommodate, because it is neither the operational genius nor the community predator. It is something smaller and more human, a man who would not let his oldest friend destroy himself out of loyalty to someone who could not be worth that price. The Country Boys model worked because Frank Lucas built it on real relationships, real loyalty, real human bonds that had been formed over decades before anyone was thinking about distribution networks and compartmentalization and operational security. When the model finally broke, when the DEA finally found the leverage it had been looking for, it broke not because the structural design failed. It broke because Frank Lucas himself reached into it and opened the door. He did it for Calvin Reed. He did it for the boy on the dirt road in Greensboro. He did it because 30 years of friendship is not an operational variable. It is a fact about a person. And facts about people, in the end, override even the most carefully designed systems. The Country Boys as an operational model ended with Frank Lucas's arrest in January 1975. The men who had formed its human infrastructure dispersed. Some served sentences. Some, like Calvin Reed, cooperated and received consideration. Some were never charged, their compartments too small, their piece of the picture too limited to justify the resources of prosecution. They went back to their lives, to Newark and Baltimore and Philadelphia, and some of them, back to North Carolina. They took with them the specific experience of having been part of something that was simultaneously a criminal organization and a community, a structure built on genuine human relationships that was deployed in service of something that caused genuine human devastation. The moral accounting of the Country Boys is, like everything in the Frank Lucas story, resistant to simplicity. These were men who made choices. Adult choices, made with full understanding, or as full an understanding as Frank Lucas's compartmentalization permitted, of what they were participating in. They are not victims. The communities their distribution network served were the victims, and the Country Boys served those networks. But they were also men who came from limited options, who found in Frank Lucas's proposition a path to something better, for themselves, for their families, than anything the legitimate economy was offering them. Men who maintained real loyalty to real relationships for real reasons. Men who, in Calvin Reed's case, sat in silence for 3 days rather than hurt someone they loved. The human complexity of the Country Boys is the human complexity of people in impossible situations, making choices that are neither entirely free nor entirely constrained, neither entirely good nor entirely bad. Frank Lucas built his empire on their loyalty. The loyalty was genuine. The empire was devastating. Both things were real. When Frank Lucas walked into that federal holding room and told Calvin Reed to talk, he was acknowledging something that his operational discipline had always bracketed and set aside. The people who built the invisible empire were people. Not operational variables, not assets to be managed. People with families and loyalties and the specific, irreducible dignity of having chosen to trust someone who told them to. Calvin Reed trusted Frank Lucas. Frank Lucas, in the end, honored that trust in the only way that was left to him. He walked through a door. He sat across a table. He said, "Tell them what they need to know." And Calvin Reed, who had been a boy on a dirt road in Greensboro, who had been a factory worker in North Carolina, who had been a distributor in Newark, who had been a man in silence for 72 hours. Calvin Reed talked. That's the end of it.